Thank you, Nadia. Good afternoon, everybody. So I'm going to be speaking about not so much about what's going on in Egypt itself as what's been going on in the what's been going on in the relationship between Egypt and the United States. So you know, there's a common narrative about what has happened in the U.S.-Egyptian relationship since 2011, since the uprising in Egypt in 2011. And the narrative goes something like this, that everything was really going pretty smoothly between the United States and Egypt until 2011. We had this long-term partnership. And then when the uprising came about in 2011, the United States threw Mubarak under the bus, as it goes. That the United States then supported the Muslim Brotherhood and kind of lost out in the political struggle in Egypt. And but with the kind of restoration of a government that is largely dominated by the military, that you know, the United States is happy enough with that situation, particularly the Trump administration is happy with that situation, and things are more or less back to normal in that relationship, if not back to normal inside of Egypt itself. That's a kind of narrative that I hear a lot. But I have to tell you, I don't think that's what's going on at all. So I mean, let me just mention, for example, on August 22nd of last year, the Department of State announced that $97 million in military and economic assistance to Egypt was being cut, and that an additional $195 million in military assistance was being withheld until certain conditions were fulfilled. Now, the conditions weren't made public exactly, but between public statements made by U.S. officials and some leaks in the press and so forth, it was possible to piece together that there were several specific concerns. One of them had to do with Egyptian military dealings with North Korea, and two others had to do with things related to non-governmental organizations. One was the case in which a group of workers in American NGOs, those workers were some of them Egyptians, some of them Americans, some nationals of other countries, were convicted of working without a permit in the country in a court case, and their NGOs were effectively kicked out of the country. And the other thing was a new NGO law that the Egyptian government passed recently that was very draconian. I'll mention also that in the summer of 2016, the Obama administration kind of quietly canceled $108 million in assistance for Egypt, economic assistance in Egypt, after a nonprofit called the Research Triangle Institute, which carries out a lot of USAID programs and had been carrying out USAID programs in Egypt since the mid-1980s, was effectively kicked out of Egypt, although it had been working on some higher education programs that were carried out directly with the ministries in the Egyptian government. So why am I bringing up these cases? The details may or may not be interesting to you, but what we're looking at is that we're talking about almost $500 million of assistance to Egypt, much of it military assistance that has been either about 300 million. No, I'm sorry, about 200 million of it canceled. Sorry, it's 400 million total, and another 200 million put on hold. And this tells you a lot about what's been going on in this relationship. And these are trends that have been building for a very long time. And what's been going on, in my view, is that the US-Egyptian relationship has lost its mooring and lost its sense of purpose. It's gone from, what it started out as in the late 1970s was a very hopeful partnership that was going to foster regional peace, security cooperation, economic prosperity, and so forth. And I would say that sort of hopeful narrative persisted in some way into at least the early 2000s. But then there were increasing tensions, as we know, with the Bush administration, although a lot of cooperation on economic reform with the Mubarak government during the Bush administration, although we know tensions on democracy and human rights related things. But then we have this very strong distrust and sometimes outright expressions of hostility since the 2011 uprisings. And nowadays, the United States engages with Egypt, I would say, more out of fear than out of hope. And it's really out of fear of the consequences of large-scale instability in Egypt and what that might bring. So annual economic assistance to Egypt is now 10% of what it was a long time ago. There were times in which early in the relationship, the United States was giving $1 billion of economic assistance to Egypt. It went down a bit, but it was hundreds of millions of dollars for many, many years, for decades. And now it's very little. It'll be 100 million or so or less. Military assistance has technically remained on track at $1.3 billion annually, but it's increasingly hampered by conditions. Congress has more and more been writing conditions related to human rights into the military assistance, and somewhat surprisingly, that administrations, the Obama administration at the very end of Obama's second term, and now the Trump administration are actually exercising that and are actually withholding some of this assistance, at least some of it related to the conditions that are in the assistance about human rights and so forth, including civil society. So, what's at the root of all this deterioration? And I've had to come to the conclusion that fundamentally it's about the role of the military in Egypt. And this, it's kind of surprising because what has happened is the more overt military control has become, and the more insistent the Egyptian military has become about controlling everything and suppressing all forms of dissent, the further apart the US and Egypt have drifted. And the more we see these very, I'm sorry to be so crassly talking about money, but to me, these are the sort of the real expressions of how this relationship works. The more these things have deteriorated. And it really is kind of ironic when you think that the United States has invested nearly $50 billion in military assistance in Egypt since the late 1970s. That's apart from the economic assistance. So the United States is deeply invested in the Egyptian military. And you would think that maybe for the United States, having the military strongly and overtly in control would be a good thing, since it's something that the United States has invested so much in. But actually, the less control that civilians have had inside the Egyptian government, the more trouble this relationship has gotten into. So at earlier times, under Mubarak, even under the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces, under Morsi, there were civilians who counted for something, inside the Egyptian government, and their advice and their suggestions about how to handle things counted for something. They didn't always carry the day. But that has become less and less the case. So this whole idea, for example, this whole NGO case that has caused a tremendous amount of trouble between Egypt and the United States, as far as we know, it goes back to the military and intelligence apparatus, perhaps military intelligence itself, of which President Sisi was the head at the time in 2011. This is where the whole case originated, and the whole idea of going after foreign NGOs who were carrying out civil society and democracy assistance in Egypt with the tacit approval and even cooperation of the Egyptian government. They were, for example, invited to organize, and help in monitoring elections and so forth by the Egyptian Electoral Commission. But the idea, I think, was that these organizations, that NGOs, whether they are domestic NGOs or foreign NGOs, are dangerous and what were behind the 2011 uprising, and that the military, I think, has been acting, against that forces. Now, in my view, I think it's an erroneous view. I mean, to think that organizations like the National Democratic Institute, the International Republican Institute, the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, et cetera, were the ones that fomented the 2011 uprising in Egypt is, I think, is completely incorrect and a gross overestimation of their influence inside the country. But at any rate, it seems to be a fixed idea in the minds of many in the military leadership, and I think that includes President Sisi. So, this is, it's become in a way kind of almost a metaphor, this whole crazy NGO case and all the phases it's been through. But we've seen now, quite a bit of sort of steady pushback from the United States. And this despite how much President Trump evidently seems to, I don't know if I would say he likes President Sisi. I would say he wants to show public friendliness for him and approval of him. Whether he likes him personally or not, I don't know. And that's a separate issue. But despite that, we're still a nation of institutions, and the U.S. Congress plays a big role in these relationships, especially in the assistance relationships, right? Because it's ultimately the Congress that appropriates the money for these assistance relationships and can impose conditions on them and so forth. So, the old shared goals between the United States and Egypt of regional peace, economic prosperity, military interoperability between U.S. and Egyptian forces in order to secure the region. Frankly, even to recite those now, it sounds almost silly, almost laughable, right? These things don't seem achievable anymore, and there isn't a new set of goals to replace them. I mean, if we think about it, there are things that are talked about, right? Will there be a U.S. peace plan for Israel and the Palestinians, or Israel and the Gulf Arabs, excluding the Palestinians? Whatever the plan would be, and would Egypt play a role in this? It seems far-fetched, frankly, that this will come about. Can Egypt has an important role in Libya, but the U.S. and Egypt largely disagree about what should happen in Libya. Same thing with Syria. The idea of Egypt somehow participating in a joint Arab force with the Saudis and Emiratis and others inside of Syria. There are a lot of problems with that idea, but maybe the first one is that Egypt and those other Arab countries don't agree on what should happen inside of Syria. So that could be a problem from the get-go. So, something may emerge. There's counterterrorism, of course, which is important, but there continue to be, and I hear them inside the U.S. government, strong reservations about how Egypt carries out counterterrorism, about the extensive political repression, human rights abuses, collective punishment methods used in Sinai and elsewhere in the country, and whether these are working. So I would say, it's a dilemma for the United States. The United States doesn't want to certainly doesn't want to pull the rug out from under the Egyptian government, doesn't want to be a part of fostering instability in Egypt, doesn't really want Egypt to fall fully into the strategic orbit of Russia or others. And yet, we continue to see, a very rough relationship, I would say, between the United States and Egypt because of this inability, to find a shared purpose and so forth. And I think there's much in common with what Steve Cook was discussing about the U.S.-Turkey relationship at the end of his presentation. Thanks a lot.